what I'd like to do is start by just really looking at the study of ancient human history and the kind of deep end effect that it has when you jump into that side of the swimming pool and body of information and you start researching this stuff. It doesn't take a long time to realize that as you start scratching away the surface information and shedding the textbooks from university and delving into this alternative literature, that things are not as they seem. And I think each and every one of you already knows that and has had that experience. And you've really got to go to university, and I studied pharmaceutics, spent 5 years at medical school in Johannesburg, learning about the body and the effect of drugs and that kind of stuff. And then I even spent 2 years selling drugs, legal drugs, over the counter, only to realize that that's not really what I wanted to do, and that's not my calling in life. So when I realized that there was this other whole alternative area of information and literature that's not necessarily respected by the established academic institutions, it became very exciting, because it suddenly felt like I found, the Ark of the Covenant and discovered this illegal stuff that you can get in your hands into. So one of the things that hits you first is things are not as they seem. And then the other thing is, because when you start researching this ancient human history, origins of humankind, ancient cultures, civilizations, where did it all begin? Why are we here? Who are we? Where do we come from? What does it all mean? And it all starts to cross over. And it very quickly you realize how everything, every bit of information crosses over everything else. And I'm talking about from the biblical scriptures to other ancient civilizations and their scriptures, to astronomy, to archaeology, to metaphysics, to quantum physics, to basic history, to medicine, to anatomy, to weird, wishy-washy stuff called psychic ability and stuff like that. And you just realize how everything is connected. And you might find this one little piece of information here that is completely and utterly removed from what it is you're researching, and lo and behold, a few months later, you find exactly where that piece fits. And that's really been a very exciting journey of discovery for me personally, is to find how you've got to keep an open mind at all times. And you've got to stretch your imagination and read every little piece of information that comes across your desk. And however strange a little book or an email from somebody may be, as weird and out of this world as it may seem, somehow, sometimes it catches you by surprise and gives you that really amazing piece of information. It happens to me almost on a daily basis. So everything is related. And then actually it leads to a third, my holy trinity of wisdom, which I've conjured up. And the third one is, wasn't bold enough to put it here tonight because you're a really wise audience, is everything we've been told is a lie. And I'm going to show you why I say that. Because we got to ask ourselves, how much do we really know about human history? Okay, we throw out these things all the time. We make these statements on a daily basis. Oh, it's not economically viable, or, you're an individual, you're entitled to your own opinion, and all these kind of things. By the way, all these are all not really true, but that's another presentation. If history is written by the victors, and we say this all the time, history is written by the victors, history is written by the victors. Well, what does it really mean? Stop, think about what it means, and put it into context. How can we put this into context and get some sort of scientific sense out of it? So let's first go back and analyze who we think we are right now based on current levels of information. We're told that we're the sort of pinnacle of civilization that started somewhere in Sumeria or Sumer around 6,000 years ago. And our teachers and academics and history books tell us that we've pretty much learned everything we know, or inherited everything we know from the Sumerians. From astronomy, astrology, architecture, agriculture, money, etc. We've inherited from the Sumerians. And so they've been around for 6,000 years, right? And we're now the pinnacle, we're the smartest, the wisest. All these people before us were old, they know nothing. And that's what most people in the world think today. Luckily, it's changing very rapidly, but still, that's the main body of current belief. Let's just assume that if history is written by the victors, just by show of hands, in 6,000 years, how many wars do you think we've had? Just shout out a number, anything that comes to mind in 6,000 years. Come on, be brave. 5,000 wars. Or shall we be kind to history and say we had 1 war per annum? Okay, in over a 6,000-year period. I just need you to really contextualize this, because these are very important subtleties that we don't often stop and think about. So if we had 6,000 wars in 6,000 years, how does that affect our knowledge of ancient human history, our origins, and all these things? What you'll find if you speak to statisticians or historians, they normally tell you that, well, we lose at least 50% of information after a conflict situation. That's what I got from doing my research. 50% of information probably goes lost because those that write the history books write it with a different agenda. Okay, and they'll put in there whatever they want, and we know very little about the people that were conquered by Alexander. They were just vile and evil, and they all deserve to die. Right? So if you start putting it into a very basic statistical formula and a spreadsheet like this, it doesn't take long for you to realize, even after event number 8, we already know less than 1% of the original truth. I'm not saying the Sumerians had all truth and nothing but the truth. What I'm saying is, because it's the oldest material we have, it's probably closest to the original truth that we have. So let's use that as, starting point. So within, how many years? 8 years. Within 8 years of the rise of the Sumerian civilization, we already know less than 1% of the original truth. What I particularly like is when you come down and you get to this very nice number, 124th event, 124th conflict. So it's only 124 years into civilization. We have that long, lovely number there. And I like that number because that's also known as Planck's constant, 10 to the minus 34. And essentially what this tells us is by the time we get to event 124, we already know less about our human origins than is permissible by the laws of physics. And that's an interesting thing to contemplate. So just let's put that into context. So if we say, or if I say that we know nothing about our human history, I'm already starting to believe that, and I really do believe that everything we've been taught is a lie, because it's just a convoluted distortion after distortion after distortion. And we've got to be very, very careful about what we believe about all the stuff in the past. What we do know from science is that we live in an electromagnetic universe where everything vibrates and spins. And these are very important things, very important principles. From the smallest atomic and subatomic structures, everything vibrates and spins. And in fact, we're told that the only reason this universe exists because of the spin and the vibration of all matter in it. If it stopped vibrating and stopped spinning, it would just disappear, and there'd be this weird ethereal kind of energy left behind, which we don't quite understand. Some people go and call it God or whatever, the divine being, or I'm not so sure about that, because there's some other interesting things that happen, which is what I'm working with on our new book, Secret Numbers of God, with the brilliant Willem de Swart. But that's something else again. But everything vibrates and spins, and the planets vibrate around our sun, just like the atoms, and have the electrons and all the other subatomic particles going crazy. Quantum physicists will tell you a whole bunch more about that, because it seems that it's not really actually there, and it's the act of observation that actually makes it appear, and all these really weird things that we're starting to discover. And then we look at the galaxies that spin and vibrate, and then we realize that it's not only the atoms and the things that spin and vibrate and the planets around the sun, but our whole solar system is also actually spinning through space as it travels through space. Our solar system isn't just traveling through space. There's the sun, planets going around it. It's the whole solar system is doing this as well, and it keeps crossing the crossing the galactic plane. And with that come very interesting things that happen throughout the ages. And then we have the giant spin and the whole torus effect and motion of the entire universe that creates this weird energy, and they call dark energy and dark matter, and they still are arm wrestling about what is it, does it exist or doesn't it exist. So the point is that everything spins and vibrates, and then we get this beautiful graph that shows us the electromagnetic universe. And on the left, you got these very, very long waves, cosmic waves, and these are so long that they actually look like straight lines. On the other side, you got the pico waves and all the gamma rays that are very, very high frequency energies. And then this graph is quite nice because it mentions some very interesting things. It tells you at which frequency a rugby field vibrates. It's really important that we know that. So it's a lovely thing to throw out over a drink. So did you know that a rugby field vibrates at 10 to the 6, or what is it, 10 to the 4 hertz, and see what happens. But what's very important about, the reason I'm showing you this is because this shows us that bacteria, protozoa, viruses, and those nasty organisms that cause a lot of disease also vibrate at specific frequencies. And this we've known for a long time, and we're learning more and more about it. This is actually, I'll go more into this in the longer workshop, but when you see representations like this, it gets really confusing, because what we do is we take something that's actually a living, three-dimensional, multi-dimensional effect, and we put it on a piece of paper like this wave. Well, that's that's an electromagnetic universe, and it actually causes a lot of confusion. I know it caused a lot of confusion with me when somebody first showed me that. Well, how does that work? There's this line that, because it's actually, that's not how it looks, and that's not how it works, but that's how they show it to us on a piece of paper. And I think by even these little tiny things that we do, by trying to illustrate what this electromagnetic universe looks like on a piece of paper, could possibly cause lifelong damage to somebody, because they're trying to spend the rest of their life trying to figure out what the hell does this mean, this line here. And it's actually, if you turn it sideways, it's actually a spiral, right? So and it just goes from the teeniest one little point of singularity, whatever you want to call it, and this spiral goes on, and very quickly you realize that all these frequencies are actually connected, and nothing is separate. So right in the beginning, when I said everything is connected, it's directly linked to this vibrational frequency of the electromagnetic universe. And then we get into some very interesting things. Before we get there, very importantly, note that little thin sliver over there, right in the middle, that's the visible light. That's the light that our eyes can see. That's it. That's what our DNA allows us to see right now. And that's just a teeny weeny sliver of this electromagnetic spectrum. But strangely enough, we have this organ in our brain called the pineal gland, which is actually the third eye, and that's actually equipped to pick up all these other frequencies and these other vibrations that are out there in the universe. And personally, I believe that is actually the thing that we should be using, that little organ that has somehow been disconnected. And I'm not going to go into details why, who disconnected it, and so forth, but it's really a frequency receptor, the pineal gland. It's pretty much like your eye. It's got similar internal organs and things, but it just doesn't have a lens, and therefore it doesn't need to be on the surface. And it's perfectly protected and implanted in the middle of your head, where it can perform its function and give you things like extrasensory perceptive abilities, and etc., etc. With the discoveries of the Russians recently, in recent years, about the fact that the DNA is actually a receptor and a transmitter, and it's linked to the pineal gland. Obviously, it's linked to everything. We now start to understand that there's this feedback mechanism that starts to happen with this primordial creative light that seems to come from the galactic center. I might be jumping a little bit. That stimulates the DNA, which stimulates the pineal gland, and you got this feedback effect that suddenly people are finding themselves waking up all over the world. It's an unstoppable part of this thing called this growth explosion of consciousness. And I think it's important that people understand why that is happening. We can't control it. It's just happening all over the place. And it must be quite frightening for people that are really deeply religious or dogmatic about whatever their belief system is. And suddenly they wake up one morning and they can see things and hear things because it's just a natural evolutionary process that we're all going through, speeding up, and they freak out. They think, oh, I'm possessed by the devil. In the meantime, it's just really stuff that's happening naturally to everyone. So, what does this all have to do with ancient ruins and civilizations, you may ask? Everything, and we're coming to that. Some of the common denominators in religions are very important. I mean, even this morning I heard a wonderful thing that I haven't heard before from Anthony on our walk through the lovely town of Glastonbury. And just in Christianity, we learn that in the beginning there was the Word of God. In fact, the first action word in the Bible is God said, okay, which is a word. It's a sound frequency. In Buddhism, we have Om as a sound being the primordial creative source. So here we have two, what is often regarded as two completely separate kind of religious beliefs, and yet the founding philosophies of both bring you right back to the same point of departure, which is the utilization of sound frequency by the divine being or the creator. And I just heard this morning that even in Egyptology, there's the bird that created the sound that was the primordial creative source of all things. And that's just wonderful when you start putting these things together and you realize that it's, these ancient religions are not separated. They were actually, that it's the people that started running these religions that started introducing devices to separate the people, to really rule by divide and conquer principles, which we understand very clearly today. In sacred geometry, this can be seen very clearly as the 6 days of creation around the one. I mean, how many circles can you put around one circle? 6 circles around one. And for those of you that study sacred geometry, which I'm sure every single one of you does this, you know this, there's your very basic understanding of these principal vibrational harmonic frequency principles that make up the whole universe. And by just looking at this, you realize that why everything is connected. Because everything has to touch because of the harmonic frequencies of sound. In Buddhism, we have this beautiful logo. These guys got together when they started Buddhism and said, listen, if we're going to compete with these Christians, we better have a good logo. Because they got a really cool logo. And they came up with this logo. And, it's just, this is not what these people did. They didn't just come up with a logo and started making little, medallions and selling them. This is something that actually happened because this is where the whole fundamental thing comes out of. This is really the shape that the primordial sound creates. And in Buddhism, we also have 6 aspects, like the 6 days of creation, 6 around one, 6 aspects of Om, the Om Mani Padme Hung. And suddenly you realize, whoa, we're dealing with exactly the same thing here. And we realize that these are also directly linked to the so-called Platonic shapes. And the 5 major Platonic shapes, and the 6th or the royal one, would be the star tetrahedron. The one on the left is the tetrahedron. That's the smallest area that any 3-dimensional shape can take. And what makes these Platonic shapes very unique is because each one of those little sides is the same length as the other side in that particular shape. And I believe that these are the primordial frequencies that we're dealing with in Christianity, in Buddhism, and in many other aspects. The cube is a particularly interesting one. And when you start looking at movies like Contact, for example, you'll notice that they have a sphere that is made up of, I think it was the dodecahedron. Is that correct? Dodecahedron. And then you got the cube inside it. And once again, the work that we're doing with Willem de Swart supports all of this information, how this geometry works in crossing the dividing line between space-time and time-space. And it's all linked to these. In the beginning, there was the Word of God and the primordial frequencies of the Om and so forth. And it gets really interesting. So there you've got the 6 primordial frequencies and, the void. And then you got the stuff in the middle, which is probably the manifestation of these frequencies that gives you that beautiful logo that the Buddhists use. The pioneers of sound are Rife, Keeley, and Tesla. Royal Raymond Rife in 1931 was making some really interesting breakthroughs. And they threw a banquet for him in Pasadena, California, where they declared him or called him the man who found the cure for all disease. Well, what did he use to cure all this disease? Very basically, sound frequency. And the Rife machine, or Rife resonator, is coming back into popularity again. I'm not sure how accurate or how close to the original machine it is, but what Rife did was he actually was the guy that made the first microscopes that could see living organisms, viruses, bacteria, cells, mitosis, division, all those things. And for a long time, they didn't believe him. He had to do a lot of convincing to tell them this is really stuff, it's really happening while we're looking at it. And when he found the cure for all disease, and there's lovely stories about how he cured the cancer and the cancer ward and things like that. And he was so unhappy with these inventions that he gassed himself in his car, and it was a tragic accident. And he just disappeared before they could release his cures to the rest of the world. I'm sure the pharmaceutical industry is really mortified about that. And then this guy here is one of my heroes, John Keeley. He lived in the 1800s in Philadelphia, and he was the real guy. I believe that Rife and Tesla learned most of their trade from John Keeley. He just did so much. But the tragic thing with John Keeley is that when he died, I think it was in 1894, his entire laboratory was bought by a wealthy industrialist from, escapes me, one of the big cities on the East Coast, and moved the entire lab to his city and try and reconstruct his lab. When he couldn't get it to work, he declared John Keeley a fraud, and that's sort of where it ended. But what Keeley did was just absolutely amazing. I mean, he used, once again, what did he use? Sound vibrational frequency to crush rock, giant, 20-ton large monoliths that he crushed in minutes or even in seconds into the finest powder. He could levitate things with sound. He could drill holes any size, any depth with microscopic precision. And one of the most important things and impressive things for me is that the fact that he disassociated water with the sound frequency and got an incredible sort of, I think, 15,000 pounds per square inch, if the reports are accurate, from disassociating like 3 droplets of water with sound frequency. All this information has unfortunately been lost because he's been deemed to be a fraud. And all these guys worked with sound frequency. And then Nikola Tesla, obviously, most of you will know him, and all his work was confiscated by the FBI. When Nikola Tesla, he found that the earth rings like a bell, and in much of his writing he actually says the earth rings like a bell, and the sound frequency comes out of the earth all over the surface. And if you know how to tap into this frequency and this vibration, you can convert that into anything and any kind of tool that you want. And then he built his Tesla Tower on the left. That's the tower that he built in 1901 or 1902. They built that tower in Long Island in New York. And he was funded by a very interesting guy called J.P. Morgan. And you obviously know what his intentions were. J.P. Morgan, he was probably the wealthiest man in North America at that stage. And the one thing that he did not know is that Tesla was building this tower under probably false pretenses. Because by that stage, Tesla had already invented and discovered this radiant energy, this free energy that traverses or travels through space instantly. It didn't travel like electricity, or at the speed of light or speed of sound or anything like that. It traveled instantly from point A to point B and delivered this radiant energy, which is non-polar, non-lethal form of energy. And with that, Tesla wanted to wire up the whole world. And obviously when when this guy, Morgan, discovered that Tesla was going to give the whole world free energy, that brought to an end the funding. And shortly afterwards, they came and chopped down the Tesla Tower. But the saddest thing is that it wasn't just, today, if you can't pay your bills, they'll say, sorry, close your bank account, and you go belly up. That didn't go, it didn't just happen. They sent in the FBI, came in and confiscated all Tesla's work. So we know where all that information sits. It sits with the FBI. On the right-hand side, that's one of Tesla's most brilliant inventions, and we should be using that today. It's free energy. It's this light bulb, wireless light bulb, that you could hold in your hand, and it just starts to glow. It picks up the energy from your body and starts to glow. This is not science fiction or something that somebody made up. This was done. And there's some other interesting reports that Tesla and Keeley might have collaborated on developing some of these lights to put into towns as street lamps, because they discovered that there was this specific frequency of light and this frequency that the light could emit that could cure all disease. And so as you walk down the street through these towns, you'd be cured of whatever it is you had. And that's an interesting concept. So that obviously went down the drain as well. In fact, some of these lights, I'm not sure how you put them out. That's the question that no one's answered yet. So you walk into the room and the light's hanging on the side, and as you walk in, it picks up your energy, and whoosh, the room starts to glow. But how do you put it out? I don't know. So what does this all have to do with ancient ruins and civilizations? Well, it seems to me, and I'm going to show you, that it seems like Tesla, Rife, and Keeley just rediscovered what these ancient civilizations knew and what they were practicing over 200,000 years ago. And that really starts to boggle the mind and starts to tell us that we know nothing about ancient civilization, nothing about our real history, who we are, where we come from, why we're here. We need to start again and start realizing that there's a new body of evidence that we need to start dealing with, that you're going to discover tonight. This is how we see ancient civilizations, and that is not a good thing, really. This has got to get us nowhere. Because if this is how we see ancient civilizations, then obviously we have a problem with these kind of structures. And you all know these structures very well. Incidentally, my take on this, I've been looking at Stonehenge from a distance, from books and DVDs and documentaries, and when I arrived here the other day and went to Stonehenge, I nearly fell on my back. And I have a completely different take on this particular structure and its age, and I'll tell you right at the end what I think it is and how old it is. This one, obviously, we know, is much evidence being presented by geologists that this Sphinx is not just a few thousand years old, but probably at least 10 or 12 or 13,000 years old. Just really based on basic scientific evaluations. And this is what sometimes our academic friends that are paid to go and research something and dig for something and find clues and find evidence. When they find that evidence, they stop. Okay, so when you've got someone that's funded by somebody to go and dig to find something with an agenda, you're never going to find the truth. Unless you get individual, completely independent researchers who don't answer to anyone, I suppose people like me, and many others in this room, and many others that have spoken at Megalithomania this weekend. If you don't have an agenda or a funder, and maybe you're more likely to tell the truth. And then this, obviously, this is ridiculous. This is really ridiculous. I don't know if some of you have seen the attempts on History or Discovery Channel when these really smart people try and show us how these people made these stones. It's just so ludicrous that you realize that whatever they're showing you, that's exactly not how they did it. Put them on these stumps and roll them, and there were some really incredibly laughable, childish and foolish attempts to try and show us how they made these stones and how they made them fit together perfectly. Until you start contemplating vibrational frequency and the concept of being able to manipulate the matter inside the rock and making it malleable. And it changes everything. I'm not talking about heat. I'm talking about cool, malleable rock that you can mold like plasticine and just let it set. That, at this stage, remains the only real plausible scientific explanation. Otherwise, everything else just seems really stupid. And then obviously this one, northeast Lebanon, the temple of or Baalbek, it's known as Baalbek, or the temple of Jupiter. Those are two people standing there, as you can see in the middle. You can see the size of those rocks. They're actually quite spectacular. As far as I know, these are still the largest rocks ever ever discovered, carved by humans, or we think they're carved by humans. We have no way of moving this today. You speak to engineers, you speak to people that work in industry and construction, and they look at this and they tell you there is no way we're going to move this today. It's not possible. You might be able to do it with these giant cranes that work, in the harbors, but you got to be right there and move it, not up a hill and put them into place and these, perfectly positioned Lego blocks. And then obviously these structures, and we've been told some very interesting things about these structures, and you obviously know all this, but I find this quite laughable, and sometimes all you have to do is test the lie, okay? First of all, no mummy has ever been found in any pyramid. Okay, no, you obviously know this, but there are a lot of people out there that do not know this, and because every time they find a new mummy in Egypt and it comes on the 8 o'clock news or whatever, what do they do first? They show you a pyramid. They show a pyramid, and they show these guys with some dishcloths on their heads carrying this mummy, and people think, oh, there's another mummy coming out of a pyramid somewhere. Well, that's what happens. And people are so indoctrinated by this, and the lie is perpetuated so much that that's what pyramids are built for mummies. And that's obviously not the case. There was a beautiful incident recently where Zahi Hawass was being interviewed. They were showing the lost pyramid of Khufu's brother, whose name I forget now. And they were showing this pyramid. They found the foundations, and they caught Zahi Hawass in this beautiful moment of where he just lost it. And he said, just imagine all these pyramids being built for these pharaohs as burial chambers. It's just a pity that all the bodies have been stolen. And I went, I can't believe what I just heard him say. This is fantastic. We must use this clip. But I just want to share this with you, because we're told that pyramids built by 100,000 men over 20 years, the Great Pyramid, right? Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of what they were covered by, this beautiful, smooth limestone and, perfect symmetry and all that stuff, and the giant 100-block granite inside, and the 100-ton blocks inside, and the 300 tons blocks inside. Let's just talk about the square stones that make up the outside of the pyramid. And there's a guess that's going around about 2.6 million of these, right? So I do this normally in my workshops. I take out your calculator and you do the numbers, right? Let's see how plausible this is. 100,000 men over 20 years. If you do the numbers, from on your marks, get set, go, carve the rock, get it into place, put it into place. Basically, what you have to do over a 20-year period, you have to put one of those blocks in place every 2 minutes. Now, so let's just test the rubbish that we are told. Just do a little bit of calculation. Very quickly, you figure out that it's not plausible. It's not doable. It didn't happen that way. And let's leave it at that. We know enough about the pyramids. What's really interesting is that some really brave archaeologists are coming out, and one of them is Carmen Bolter, Canadian PhD archaeologist. She's actually coming to visit me in South Africa next week. We're going to do some major explorations of the ruins of South Africa. She did a fantastic documentary called The Pyramid Code, 5 one-hour episodes, which is completely different from anything I've ever seen, and is really exciting that we're getting real academics and archaeologists that are going out there on a limb and saying, okay, we've had enough of all this crap in the past. Let's start, spilling some of the real beans. And she goes out and very simply calls it. They were resonating chambers for the creation of energy. Very simple. And we start seeing the repetition of this kind of information. Very important thing that we need to identify is the definition of mythology. I found from my research that it was around 1270, that's how far back I can date it, where the word mythology suddenly changes from what it originally meant. The original meaning of the word mythos in Greek, mythology, is not what we use it as we use it today. The original meaning means words, written words, story, legend, historic events that were sworn to be accurate and true by priests and kings. Does it sound like fairy tales? Like imaginary things happening in the past? No, it's completely the opposite. So what we realize is that history and mythology are not separate events. In fact, mythology is history. And suddenly our human history takes on a completely different account and a different feeling. And suddenly we see all these weird, crazy creatures flying around and flying machines and all these things happening and the sons of the gods coming down and etc., and building these amazing things and creating slaves to do this and that, and because that's what it is. Mythology equals history. And we've got to start embracing that notion. Somewhere, somehow along the way, somebody changed the meaning of that word. When we start searching for our human history, we find that many, many authors have been writing about the southern tip of Africa as the cradle of humankind. I know this because we face it every day in South Africa. The cradle of humankind signs everywhere. When you go to Joburg, you're in the cradle of humankind. That's what is being sold as to the rest of the world. And but what they do is they take Australopithecus and Homo erectus, they throw them into one pot and they throw humans in there and they say, "See, honey, this is where we come from." And they forget that it's it's the theory of evolution. It's not the fact of evolution. And then once again, we start getting these complete confused signals that we send people. But fortunately, the Sumerian tablets tell us a lot of this information in great detail. Where we come from, why we're here, who created us, for what purpose, and so forth. And then we find this really insane selective approach by historians, and this is where I get really frustrated, because they tell us about all this amazing stuff we've inherited and learned from the Sumerians, and the moment they start reading about these weird flying gods and the creation process and this and that, they go, "Oh, no, we can't believe that. That's far too way out for us. I haven't read that in any textbook, so we can't believe it. We're going to believe our textbooks and not the Sumerian tablets." So the one on the left, for example, is these are two of the Sumerian kings lists. There have been several more found, but these two are particularly interesting because they seem to corroborate each other. And the one on the left talks about a period of 212,000 years. It gives you the names of 8 kings and the periods they ruled over a 212,000-year period before the flood. The one on the right is even more interesting because that gives you names of about over 140 kings and probably more because it's quite chafed as well. But it tells us at least the names of 10 kings that ruled over a 224,000-year period. I believe 224,000 years before the flood. And we choose to disregard this information. It also tells us who Yahweh was, who destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and all kinds of other interesting things, but we're not going to believe that. They were drunk when they wrote the stuff. Very important definitions. The first Holy Trinity, in my opinion, we get in the Sumerian tablets, and I believe that all other Holy Trinities and all other ancient religions and mythology and history probably originate from these guys. The Sumerian Anu, Enlil, and Enki, the supreme commander of the so-called Anunnaki and his 2 sons. In the Bible we meet the Anakim, the giants. Well, I don't see any difference between the Anakim and the Anunnaki. I believe they were the same group of beings. And then we meet the Elohim. Elohim is a plural, never been a singular. So when you read the original Bible and it talks about the Elohim, you've got to contextualize this and know that the Bible is talking about the gods, not God. The gods did this and that. The gods did this and that. So everything that the Bible talks about the gods, it's pretty much a parallel of what the Sumerian tablets talk about the gods and all other ancient scripts. And then we find Allah, which is a derivative of Elohim, which means it's also a plural. And then we find Genesis 6 and various other references to the Nephilim and the sons of the gods and the Watchers. And you start realizing that we're dealing with a whole other history here that has really been pretty well covered up. And all of the above, always obsessed with gold. You just cannot escape that. The most important thing out of this, however, is that the Bible and all these other ancient texts are a great source of information of a scientific nature, with incredible information of understanding of physics and sacred geometry and all these things that have really been beautifully covered by these stories that lie on top. But once you peel those stories away and you take the emotion out of it and this whole sort of piousness out of it, you start seeing this incredible information come seeping through between the cracks. The three common denominators in all of ancient human history, according to me: gold, slavery, and the winged serpent. You cannot separate humanity from gold, its obsession with gold, and especially humans' God's obsession with gold. Think about this. Adam was on his own on earth. Eve had not yet been fashioned, and God already tells Adam in Genesis 2 that he wants to take him to the land of Havilah, where the water is good, the land is good, and there is gold. Because I want you to dig for the gold for me. And slavery, obviously, that's an insane concept, how these early humans would have just suddenly come up with this concept of slavery, gone over the mountain, enslaved a whole bunch of Neanderthal people and said, you're going to come work for us. It makes no sense. Unless somehow along the way they were given that idea by someone else. And it seems like this idea came from their gods. And then obviously the winged serpent. It's interesting that this image that is used today still by the modern medicine was probably one of the oldest symbols in the world and on earth and human history, and the Sumerian entity Enki. And into this symbol we can read all kinds of things. We can read a double helix of the DNA, we can read vibrational frequency, a matter, we can read levitation, we can read climbing the axis of Mundi, we can read all kinds of interesting encoded messages in this. And you realize that those three you cannot separate from human history. And also, if you start looking at ancient civilizations, the fact that the so-called winged serpent or the feathered serpent or the flying serpent is this common denominator in all these ancient cultures, including South Africa, Southern Africa, the Americas, and even in China, in the East. When you see the dragon with its little wings, it's not really a dragon, it's just a serpent, a winged serpent. And in Southern Africa, just to show you that this serpent worship is very, very alive and active, this is known as the Tsodilo Caves in northern Botswana. The current dating on it is about 70,000 years old, but it's a lot older than this. I know this from speaking to Credo Mutwa, the wise shaman in South Africa, one of the wisest men that you'll ever meet. And he speaks very passionately about this particular site as the creation cave of the human race. And he says it is this cave, the serpent worship site, and Adam's calendar, which you'll see a little later, which are the two most sacred sites on earth, and both of them are directly linked to the creation of the human race. What real evidence do we have of these early humans? Who were they? How did they live? What did they do? Well, let's get back to the history books again. Our current belief system is that Southern Africa was sparsely populated, very few inhabitants before about 1,000 years. Until then, there was hardly anybody there. They throw out numbers like 5,000 people, or maybe even less. And these are kind of numbers you deal with. And then you see these maps, and these maps look very impressive. It looks like these people really know what they're talking about. Look, those arrows point in exactly the right direction, and that's where they came from, that big red blob up there. And so it really looks impressive. But it's just the biggest pile of rubbish you've ever seen. Because this is not got anything to do with the ancient history of Southern Africa. And we know this because the ancient stone ruins that we've been discovering tell us a completely different tale. The biggest and the saddest part of this is that these stone ruins that we've been discovering have been labeled as cattle kraal for so long now that they've just been completely ignored. And the roads department, the forestry departments, the town planning guys, they just don't give a damn about these stone ruins. When they come across them, they just put bulldozers through them and just push them out the way. So much damage has been done through sheer ignorance, and I must add here, arrogance, because of the previous slide that you saw, that nothing of significance ever came out of Southern Africa, that they just, destroy probably the most precious and valuable ancient human structures that we have on this planet. Just to take you through some of these very quickly. for those of you that saw them the other day, most important thing to notice is that they're all circular. And some of them have complex internal structures, some of them have very basic internal structures. And while they are circular, each and every one is completely unique. And that, to me, is a very, very important, significant discovery here, because that's not how we build structures today. And even if you look at the African tribal settlements and that, you see very similar. The huts look exactly the same. It's one hut repeated after the other. Well, this is not what we see here. We see every single stone circle is completely unique. And that I can promise you, that's a fact. And then we see some really complex structures. This is the internal portion of a much larger circle, just to show you how complex they get. Some of these walls are about 2 meters wide still and about 3 meters high. And then you start seeing that from the central circle, you start getting this interesting, this sort of spider's web effect that goes outwards. And sometimes the spider's web effect goes all the way down the mountain, interspersed with other terraces and other stone circles. There's a very nice example of a basic circle, or a simple structure inside a circle. And then you get these really complex structures. And then you see little teeny-weeny circles inside the big circles. And this is really puzzling. And I must tell you that very little excavation has happened at any of these. This is a question I get asked all the time. Well, how come no one's excavated these? Well, they have done some excavation in these, but they never dig deeper than about 1 meter. Or maybe 1.5 meters. And then they find something and then they stop. And they say, you see, this was built by the so-and-so people. And I go, guys, proof of habitation does not mean proof of construction. Isn't this the first rule of archaeology? Civilizations built on top of each other. Civilizations move and reoccupy previous civilizations' habitation, and they adapt it to their own. So we've got to go a lot deeper than 1 meter to start finding the real reason behind why these things are there. And there you got some more interesting circular shapes inside other shapes. And what you will know once you studied this a lot longer, you'll realize that these two circles were actually linked at one stage. It's just not that visible anymore. This is a very interesting structure that I'll show you a little bit later. And then you start seeing some really interesting shapes, like that horseshoe shape on the left with the little 2 towers next to it with a perfect circle in the middle. And once you start seeing horseshoe shapes, and you understand the principles of sound and the frequency, the alarm bell should start ringing. That something very strange and weird and sinister is going on here that we haven't figured out. Note the extended area that's been destroyed around the main structure. And this is the same thing happens over and over again. You just see these eroded, completely eroded areas around the main circular structures. And then you get thousands of these inside the forestry areas, destroyed by forestry. Many, many of them, countless of these stone circles have been destroyed by forestry. There's another one of those horseshoe shapes. That's inside a much larger stone circle. And then lovely aerial shot from a helicopter. And if you look in between these two visible circles, if you look up here on the left, you'll see that there's actually a lot more there that's covered by soil. Now, it's important to note that none of these have any doors or entrances, and this is the big anomaly that our archaeologists find when they go there. So they'll make a note saying, this is stone circles and this, and find no entrances, no doors, no entrances, but it must have been built by a small family of 15 to 20 people while they were migrating south. And this goes into the history books, this goes into the official records, and they just forget the fact that there's no doors or entrances. It just it doesn't matter. They didn't need doors or entrances, these people. They were just migrating. What's really interesting is, the other thing is that, did you guys count the number of stones in the circle? No. Well, do you know that there are about 500,000 stones that weigh between 20 and 50 kilograms in the stone circle? Oh, no, we didn't know this. Did you know that these stones do not come from this area? Oh, no, we didn't really pay attention to that either. And do you know that they had to carry the stones, the 500,000 stones, this small family of 15 to 20 people, carry these 500,000 stones from 2 kilometers or more down the river, at the bottom, all the way up here, to build this thing with no doors or entrances? And they lived where while they were doing this? They ate what while they were doing this? And these basic simple questions that should come naturally to, well-learned people are just completely ignored. And this is what really irritates me from time to time, so I had to get that out. So what we're really looking at here is the largest and most mysterious ancient stone settlement on earth. It consists of dwellings, workplaces, worship places, ancient roads and terraces. It covers well over 450,000 square kilometers. And the little town of Watervalboven that I now live in, which is in the province of Mpumalanga, not far from the Kruger Park, is where most of these concentrated stone structures are. Some of them that you saw here come from there. Then we get this strange thing of these agricultural terraces, thousands of kilometers, thousands and thousands of kilometers that cover pretty much the whole of the southern African continent. For a sparsely populated continent of 5,000 odd people, you got to be kidding me. What were these people obviously eating themselves to death? And they certainly didn't look like the stick figures that you see drawings of on the cave paintings. They should have been a lot larger than that. So it really, when you start putting these basic things together, something really wrong has happened here, and we've missed the boat completely. These are just some examples of these terraces. A very good friend of mine at University of Pretoria said to me, he's a brilliant archaeologist, he said to me, this is way over 5,000 years old, probably a lot older, but don't quote me on this because I'll deny it. So I'll quote him, but won't mention his name. And then you start realizing that entire mountains are covered by these terraces, and wherever you go, and this has been a huge eye-opener to people in the area, because now suddenly wherever they drive, they keep phoning me, hey, we found some terraces over there. I say, oh, cool, I'll go check them out. And it's just realized that there's this stuff just everywhere. It just doesn't stop. Okay, this is just one of my favorite photographs. Here you can see these ancient roads, terraces, circles covering the entire mountain. Notice on the bottom here, strange hexagonal shapes that are clustered together like a beehive, honeycomb. Makes absolutely no sense whatsoever why anybody would build anything like that. This is right on top of the mountain at Watervalboven. It's just spectacular. Stone circles. Notice that road that runs into that circle. What happens when it hits a circle? There's a dead end. There's a little opening there, but that was done by the farmer in recent times. There's a dead end. And the internal structures, no entrances, no doors, just these weird shapes. Interspaced by terraces. And as I mentioned already, you realize that we're dealing with these roads, these ancient roads. Now the story, if you buy the official textbooks, and I'm not going to mention names, but anyway, the current story is that these roads were built to drive the cattle on, drive by the Sotho-Tswana people or the Pedi people or the whatever people they ascribe it to. They change them every year. It's another group of people. I'm not kidding. Every year it's somebody else. Oh, no, we were wrong. It's not the Pedi people. It's now the Sotho-Tswana people. Oh, no, it's somebody else. And they built these roads to drive their cattle on. Clearly, these guys that write this have never, worked with cattle or farmed with cattle. And clearly, they don't take into account that we got thousands of kilometers of these roads in a sparsely populated continent with a few people that at that stage were reportedly didn't even have cattle. These roads come from everywhere, and what I can tell you is that the original structures in their original form were all linked by these roads, every single one of them. In this particular picture, you also see the beautiful erosion patterns which tell us that there was probably a vast movement of water that caused a lot of this destruction, because this group of photographs that we have, aerial photographs, show us the movement of the erosion in one specific direction that suggests very large volumes of water. More roads going up mountains that make no sense. And this is another beautiful one. On the bottom of the road and on top of the road, above the road, there are many, many ruins. They're just covered by meters of soil. You can't see them. If you look carefully at the picture, you'll see that actually you see them sticking, you see the patterns. And once again, we have this weird hexagonal agglomeration of ruins that are just stuck together like this honeycomb beehive effect. And often you see these little circles outside the big circle, just on its own. This is one of my favorite photographs. It's just spectacular, because you can start imagining the entire southern African continent looking like this a long, long time ago. And once again here, this is part of that series that you can see this movement of water in a specific direction when you start studying this. Personally, I believe that this entire civilization, probably jumping the gun here or missing the flow here, but I believe that this entire civilization was wiped out by the flood, the so-called event that happened around 13,000 years ago. And what happened here is that we find sea sand, seashells, fossilized fish on top of the mountains among the ruins. What happened, though, then in 13,000 years, the ruins that were on tops of the mountains, 13,000 years of rain probably washed away all the sand and soil. So the ones that are on tops of the mountains have become exposed again, and we can see those. And then they were re-inhabited later by the movement of the tribes from northern Africa. And the ones at the bottom, down the sides of the mountains, remain covered by the soil, so they're less visible. And that's the most likely kind of sense that we can make out of this. How many of these ruins are there? In 1891, Theodore Bent, he was a brilliant British archaeologist. He spent many years in southern Africa. He explored South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe. And he was the first guy to really excavate Great Zimbabwe. And there you've got a lovely photograph of the inside of the Great Zimbabwe, probably one of the most spectacular ruins anywhere on Earth. And the problem with Great Zimbabwe is that because it's so old, it confuses everybody, just like Stonehenge. And you've got thousands and thousands of years of civilizations and rehabilitation and rehabilitation and rehabilitation by different people doing different things, using different practices, leaving behind different items. So when they come across this item, they go, you see, there's so-and-so people, and they immediately ascribe it to those people. And no one's really dug right down in Great Zimbabwe, because they keep stopping and saying, this was built by these people. At the moment, the current theory goes that it was built by the Lemba people, the black Jews that came down from Egypt. And the Lemba tribe has been traced to this group of black South Africans who have this genetic, been genetically traced to the Lembas, to the ancient Egyptians. By 1974, this chap, Roger Summers, estimated 20,000 of these stone ruins, and already you start seeing a bit of a problem here. Okay, this picture is one of those beautiful views from one of the top ruins that we do a lot of work in, and just look out there. This is just looking at the adjacent mountain, and you can just see ruins everywhere. Okay, if you look closer at them from other photographs, you can see how linked they are by the terraces and those so-called roads or channels that we call now. 20,000. I got involved in 2007. And within 6 months, I guessed that there were at least 100,000 of these stone ruins. And 6 months later, it was 200,000 and so forth. When I phoned the ex-head of archaeology at Wits University, Revel Mason, he was actually quite an amazing guy. He was a lot braver than people give him credit for. But, and he got a lot of flack from the institutions as well. I think he probably kept a lot of stuff to himself that he could have published, but I think he was just afraid of getting that information out. When I asked him, how many of these ruins do you think there are? And he said, there must be at least 100,000 of these ruins. And I said, that's fantastic, because that's exactly what I figured out, 100,000. And I said, but you know what that tells us? It tells us that there must have been probably 1 million people or more living here. And there was a silence, and he said, well, then there can't be 100,000 stone ruins. And this is what happens. We have a theory, and we keep trying to squeeze the evidence into this theory. If we have 100,000 ruins, then clearly we must have a lot more people than we previously imagined. But the numbers get even more completely out of line. So I started counting, and I know many people that were here the other night, the other afternoon will say, well, how did you count all these? And I said, well, you need to know what it looks like on the ground. So you climb the mountains, you do the footwork and the legwork, you analyze, you look at it on the ground level to realize that where you're standing, there are ruins, but this is what they look like. So when you start looking at the satellite pictures, you recognize where you were and you recognize what it is you're looking at. Otherwise, you'd have no idea what you're looking at. So only then, by doing the footwork, can you start taking a reasonably accurate guess as to where these ruins are. Many of them are hidden under trees and the thick African bush. You don't know that they're there. Often even while you're driving next to the bush and you're literally 2 meters away from it. I promise you, when I take people on tour there, we're 2 meters away from big, thick walls, 2 meter wide walls. And I say, can you see the ruins in the bush? And people say, no, I can't see them. Come back next season when it's burnt down and just go, whoa, I can't believe this. It's really that amazing. You can't see the stuff. It's completely overgrown. So you need to do the legwork to be able to estimate from the satellite shots what you're talking about. And just to show you, I broke it up into similar squares like this to get an average how many circles there are per 1 hectare and then per square kilometer. And then I looked at the entire lost city and then I did a calculation. And I found 3 lost cities. One in the area of Waterval-Boven, that stretches about 100 kilometers by 150 kilometers. These are large areas. This is not small, much larger than London or Los Angeles or Johannesburg today. And the other one is other side of Rustenburg all the way to the Botswana border. And the other one is Great Zimbabwe and a huge area around it. And you start seeing some spectacular things. If you start going to Google and just look around and you'll start, now that you know what it looks like from the air, you're going to be amazed what you find. And you start counting and you get an average and you start adding this up and going through these areas, and you realize, can you see that road running at the bottom there, the channel that links those ruins together? See that all of them were originally linked by these channels. By the time I finished counting, and I was obviously I'm going back. Well done. Finger trouble. Okay, let's get back where we were. There we were. By the time I finished counting, and it's exciting, I must tell you, to look for these things on Google and on satellite photographs. And so it's really, because you think, oh, there's nothing there. And so let me look again. And you go, whoa, I missed this. Look at that. And it really, like, for example, this, you know, if you don't know what you're looking at, oh, there's just ruins. They're just everywhere. They're just everywhere. This is particularly spectacular. I've got to tell you this because this is other side of Rustenburg, between Botswana and the Botswana border and Rustenburg. This is a huge area. It's probably about, I don't know, it's just large. And the current theory, what they wrote in the report, the archaeological report, is that this was built by the so-and-so people, and it was built by the women and children. That's in the official archaeological report. I've got to tell you that some of the stones in this particular area, some of the stones are extremely large. They weigh more than a ton. Really, these are, and you go, cool. So the guys were sitting drinking beer, and the women and children were building all these stone structures. And great. And it goes on. And as you can see, when you get into the trees, it doesn't stop. It carries on. And goes on. So you've got to go there and walk there to see what's going on there. You know, you can't just assume. So there are at least 10 million of these. Okay, and it's just really important to internalize this, because if there are 10 million of these structures, and I stopped, there's more. This is not the end of it. There are more. There may be 20 million of these. I know this sounds really ludicrous, but these are the facts, and we've got to start working with these facts and realizing that there's a whole history here that we know absolutely nothing about, which tells us that there were a lot of people living here. You're not going to have 10 million of these structures and just, 20,000 or 100,000 or even 1 million people. You're going to have a lot more people than that. And I showed you already how I counted it, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. And what's all this ancient activity all about? It's all about gold, always about gold. Remember, you can't separate gold from human history. Thousands of ancient gold mines. I mean, I'm now getting farmers phoning me from all over the place saying, wow, you must come and check my ancient gold mines I got on my farm and all that. And wherever there are ancient stone circles and terraces, you'll find gold mines. And that's just how it works. This area that I'm showing you here, this is what it looks like from the air. Okay, just to get an idea. This is near Lydenburg. That's where the real gold rush happened as well in South Africa. It didn't just happen in Johannesburg. It happened in Lydenburg in the eastern Transvaal, which is now known as Mpumalanga. It actually happened there first in the mid-1800s. And most of these gold mines that look like this were carved into the side of the mountains, high up. And wherever you go, when we were walking around here looking at these, wherever there's a mine like this into the side of the mountain, there's a stone circle not far away from it. And then you see the incredible, comparisons of these ancient stone circles and then the modern buildings that they built in the 1800s. It's really interesting, and they're side by side often. In fact, some of the more modern buildings use some of the stones from the ancient stone circles to put into the modern buildings in the 1800s. And then I showed this picture already. This is just spectacular. Those people that like orbs and orb hunting, this is just amazing. It shows you how inquisitive these little fellas are about all the stuff that went down in that shaft when snooping around there. They really like that energy in there. And this is a mine. I'm going to show this to you again. And this is a mine that slipped through the fingers of the giant mining companies. It's at least 100 meters deep. It's about 5 miles away from what's known as Sheba Gold Mine today. And it's still, Sheba Gold Mine is still regarded as the wealthiest gold mine in the earth, on Earth today. In fact, stories go that there's such a rich vein of gold that comes out of there. It's almost runny. The gold is almost runny, so they keep this thing closed. And the gold mines seem to have this weird quota that they can mine. And at the end of the month, they come there and they just scrape off some extra gold to make up their quota, and then close it up again. How true that is, I don't know, but that's what I was told by one of the guys that apparently worked in Sheba Gold Mine. The farmer had to put a fence around it on the right-hand side because these sheep and cattle kept falling into it. And I nearly fell into it as well, sitting next to it. It's thinking about how stupid we were, how close we got to the edge, hanging on the edge of this tree here, with my camera down to try and get a nice picture going, because you do these crazy things. And then this wonderful woman called Anne Kritzinger from Zimbabwe University went and did a study of these so-called animal pits and grain pits and slave pits. That, incidentally, is a side view of Great Zimbabwe ruin, just to show you how impressive it is. That's a person standing there. That's a person standing there. If you haven't seen this before, Great Zimbabwe is spectacular. And you see some amazing influences, Arabic influences and all kinds of other influences because of these guys that came later and fixed it to their own liking and so forth. But in many of the ruins in Zimbabwe, there are these things called the animal pits and grain pits and slave pits, because that's what they're called, because that's the perspective that we have. These were obviously peasants, and all they had were animals, grain and slaves. That's what they had. And so Anne Kritzinger came and she did an amazing study of this, a fantastic paper she wrote. It's about 80 pages long, and she shows in absolute beautiful splendor that these were extraction flotation tanks for gold, the mining and the processing of gold. And in some places she finds a yield of 1.78 grams per ton. These are not the Zimbabwean ones, incidentally. These are the ruins near Watervalboven in South Africa that I believe were used for exactly the same purposes. And then we read in the Sumerian translations, and we start seeing some interesting Sumerian links and connections about the Sumerian god Enki, one of those Holy Trinity dudes, about the place that they called the Abzu. The translation says, great rivers there rapidly flowed, and abode by the flowing waters Enki for himself established. Now, you've just seen his abode, Great Zimbabwe. And if any of you have lived or seen mining towns in South Africa, the big house on the hill is always where the mine manager lives. That's where it is. Find any small town and want to find the mine manager, there's his house. So that's where he established his own house, and a fortress for his house he established, and other places where the workers would live. Other places are all these other stone circles and these other places that I've been showing you, where the bowels of the earth to enter, places of deepness he determined for the heroes into the earth's bowels to descend to extract the gold. I don't think it can be any clearer than that. And this is what Great Zimbabwe looks like from the air, the grandest of them all. And in case you didn't believe that it's part of the same civilization, there's a much better photograph, which also incidentally shows you that it hasn't been touched. You can see the farm, encroaching farmlands there in the top left-hand corner. And there's so much more excavation that needs to be done there. It's completely covered by soil and sediment, and especially the surrounding areas. And we've only scratched the surface with the main enclosure itself. And this is where we get to what we call the coffee break. Recently, I've just made a new discovery that there's new references that go back into the 1400s already of these ancient stone ruins in southern Africa. This chap called Antonio Fernandez, he was a degradado, the great unwashed, the prisoners that they sent out to explore the darkest, deepest Africa. And they came back and had beautiful reports of these Karanga and Makaranga people, sometimes also called Kalanga, because like the Japanese R and L gets switched around, the Kalanga of Makaranga people. And they came back and they said, you know, when they asked them who built these ruins, who built these things, they said, well, we don't know who built it. We didn't build it. Did your ancestors build it? No, we don't know. They said, well, who built it? We don't know, but it must be the work of the devil because man cannot build stuff like this. And then you read current textbooks and they tell you, oh, no, we know exactly who built it. The people that lived there built it. That's what they tell you. Well, they told us they didn't build it. Who are you going to believe? The people themselves or the historian that wrote the book? You know, this is the kind of stuff, it boggles the mind. They just make stuff up and put it into the textbook because they're going to police somebody somewhere. Anyway, some interesting discoveries. These are some really interesting discoveries at Great Zimbabwe mainly. This copper object with triangular design on it. It's not about the object, but it's the depth at which it was found, 5 feet below the surface at the eastern wall, I believe it was one of the walls. And 5 feet sediment inside a stone structure like Great Zimbabwe. 5 feet doesn't happen in 500 years, 5 feet of sediment. In fact, Theodore Bent writes about between 1.5 and 2 meters of sediment that he dug through that consistently and continuously shows indications of a gold mining civilization of 2 meters deep. That's a lot of sediment and a many, many, many years, many thousands of years of occupation. And then these mysterious bird statues of various sizes. These have probably been some of the most mysterious and sought after objects that have been found in Zimbabwe. And they are really beautiful. I'll show you some now. And then the most probably sought after object, in my opinion, alongside the Ark of the Covenant, is the missing lintel that was above the main entrance of Great Zimbabwe with a written inscription on it. So clearly whoever built Great Zimbabwe and wrote this inscription on this lintel had the knowledge of writing. Well, when the Portuguese arrived there, all the tribes that lived there had no knowledge of writing. There was no wheel. They didn't have a written language or written script. Who built Great Zimbabwe? Who wrote the stuff on the lintel? These are important questions we need to ask. And then we find that we have these interesting rocks that the letters that Theodore Bent found on this rock in Botswana. Now, I'm not saying this is the language that was written on the lintel, but it could have been. And this, if we ever find that lintel, we'll probably get a lot more information out of it. Tomorrow in the workshop, I'll be going into a bit more detail about this writing of the lintel, where it is, because I believe I know where it is, but there's not enough time for that today. And then we find the interesting links to all the so-called ancient and great civilizations of the North. And suddenly, slowly, and yet suddenly, the penny drops. That all these ancient civilizations got all their knowledge, all their symbolism, and everything they put into practice that we thought was so ancient and great. They got all of it from this lost civilization in southern Africa. All of these people. And ultimately it was always about gold. This Phoenician constellation was beautifully carved into a wooden bowl found near Great Zimbabwe. This Roman coin of Antoninus Pius, 138 AD, was found 25 meters deep in a gold mine in Zimbabwe, a place called Umtali. This Sumerian Babylonian coin from 300 BC was found in the foundations, when they're digging the foundations for Marian Hill Monastery in the province of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. I went and saw this coin just a few weeks ago when I was doing my tour of KwaZulu-Natal. It's sitting in this little museum at Marian Hill Monastery. You know, there's a Babylonian coin saying, what? 300 BC? And then you find some really interesting things. This Egyptian headrest on the left, and this Southern African headrest on the right, and instantly you see the architecture. The pillars of Egypt and the concentric circles of Southern Africa. It's absolutely fantastic. And in the same little museum I just mentioned, there are a number of these headrests with these little concentric circles, exactly like this, and they're actually quite small. It's about this size. And when you look very carefully at the top of this headrest, you find these beautifully carved Maltese crosses. And even the headrest that I saw there also has these Maltese crosses carved into it. It's quite spectacular. You go, what the hell's going on here? You know, we got cross-pollination going here between north and south. And you realize that we have a direct link between the symbol of the cross, which is probably one of the oldest symbols we have on this planet, that takes us back to the ancient civilizations and really the beginning edges of the origins of humankind, and these symbols that they carved. Remember that ancient symbols were powerful symbols. They had power in them. They weren't just these things and logos that they created because they wanted to sell some fancy Levi jeans or something, you know. They created powerful symbols that were filled with meaning and power. And the cross was such a symbol. And we find this cross among thousands and thousands of petroglyphs that are carved into this very, very hard rock called andesite. It's the same rock as diorite. Now, some of you may know diorite as the rock that many of the pharaonic statues are carved out of, this black, very dark rock. It's very, very hard. It's probably the second hardest rock you can find. If you look at these statues of the pharaohs from Egypt in the British Museum, made out of diorite, you can see it's still shiny and smooth, as if it was carved yesterday. And some of them are 5,000 years old. And then you look at these here, these carvings into this andesite, diorite, and you look at the erosion on this, and the cracks that emerge through these, and suddenly the penny drops very, very quickly, and you realize that you're dealing with something that is so old and so eroded that no one has ever contemplated these kind of dates. And when you ask a geologist about this kind of erosion and say, well, how long will it take to erode to this level? They just shake their head. They just go, no, don't put me on the spot. I'm not going to give you a number. I don't want to be put on record. I say, I'm not going to put you on record, for God's sake. Just give me your personal estimate. Okay, well, it's hundreds of thousands of years. I say, good, that's all I wanted to hear. So we're dealing with stuff that's really old, really, really old, older than we've ever possibly imagined. And it's important to note that this is an ancient African symbol. It's not a Sumerian symbol. It's not an Egyptian symbol. It means Mabona, Lord of Light, in ancient African culture. And if you thought the Sumerian winged disc was originally from Sumeria or Sumer, you're mistaken. We find beautiful carvings of these crosses inside a circle with wings coming out of them. There's one on the right-hand side. They're beautifully three carved wings or lines coming out of that cross in a circle. You can't see it very clearly, but I promise you it is there. I took this picture myself. I know exactly where the stone lies in the veld near the town of Carolina. And that's what it means. Once again, great is the all-seeing Lord of the sky, Mabona. And you start seeing the correlations of the Sumerians and the story of the planet of the crossing and the gods coming down from the sky and creating this slave species, and so it goes. And you see the lines start to cross and the mythologies start to combine, and we start getting a far more unified story of human origins. And then we get this interesting thing, the sun worship culture that also suddenly emerges. And you see many, many of these beautiful carvings once again in this andesite. You can see the erosion even from where you're sitting. It's dramatic erosion. Look at the one on the right-hand side. That one is quite interesting because it also resembles very, very closely one of the 4 symbols that are used by the Dogon people for the seeding of life. That picture on the right. It's that incomplete circle that goes inside itself, and these lines that come out at very specific points around the circle representing the creation of life. The Dogon people of Mali use it, and we find it, this carving here in South Africa, that's hundreds of thousands of years old, with beautiful cracks and showing erosion through it. And then we get to this really mysterious thing. So we've already spoke about the Makaranga, children of the sun, sun-worshipping cultures. And then this word Abantu, the name of the African people in southern Africa, the Abantu people. No one's ever known or been brave enough to tell us where that word actually comes from. Well, Credo Mutwa, the brilliant South African Sangoma shaman who's inspired millions and millions of people around the world, he told me very clearly where the word Abantu for the African people comes from. It comes from Abantu, the children of Antu, a Sumerian goddess, the wife of Anu. And this sort of north-south Sumerian link just gets stronger and stronger all the time. These mysterious birds, these are the Zimbabwe birds I spoke about. Some of them are very big, some of them are very small. They come in all shapes and sizes, but in essence what it is a broad base to a narrow tip. It's got a little angle at the top, and this is the distinctive sort of shape of these Zimbabwe birds. Well, the brilliant Theodore Bent once again comes to the rescue, and when he was exploring Egypt and the Near East and all the gold mines there, he found that this goddess, this goddess Hathor, she seems to have worn very many caps in ancient Egypt. But one of the caps she wore she was the goddess of the gold mines and the protector of the gold miners, and this was her symbol, the bird on a pedestal. And in all the gold mines that he explored, at the entrances to the gold mines, they carved this little glyph to protect the gold miners as they go into the gold mines of Egypt and the Near East. Well, where were the first and the oldest gold mines in the world? In southern Africa. And suddenly we realized that these birds on a pedestal were actually the earliest statues and the mascots and the protectors of these very, very early gold miners in southern Africa, 200, maybe even 300,000 years ago, because that's how far back it goes, just short of 300,000 years. And these are some of the statues that I've been finding by the dozen. I mean, literally, I must have found hundreds of these. And I believe that these are actually the very early prototypes of these Zimbabwe bird mascots of these early gold miners, because they are scattered throughout all these thousands of stone circles that I've visited and climbed through. This broad base to a narrow top. Some of them, like the one on the right there that I'm holding with a big fat grin on my face, because I was so excited when I found that one, I could hardly contain myself. And even the fat body and the little neck and the little angle at the top, you can clearly see that this is where they were going with this, way over 100,000 years ago. And you'll find out why I can say that it's 100,000 years ago, because we look at the patina and the growth of the patina. This has been carved, and you'll understand why I say that just now. This is something I found very recently, another one. I was driving down the mountain, and there's this beautiful, beautiful bird-shaped carve. This is a stone that you can clearly see. This is a carving out of a stone. And you can look at the thick reddish patina that's growing on it. It was just sitting on the edge of the mountain road, about to slide down, and we caught it just in time. Thank God for that, because once it slid down there, I would have never found it. So you find these treasures and these ancient artifacts just lying in the forestry roads all over the place, and they've just been missed. Trucks drive over it. One of the best examples of there's this beautiful long stone that I picked up. A forestry truck was driving in front of me, and the back wheels went over it, and this thing bounced up. This long stone about this, it looks like a Stone Age club. And I looked at it and stopped the car, picked it up, and it's become one of my most precious tools that I've discovered, because that is one of the ones that rings the most beautifully. I'll talk about that. And these birds become giant monoliths. Okay, this chap standing there is about 6'8". He's a tall bugger. Just to give you an idea how big that statue is, it's a close-up of its face, because at the angle that it stands at, you sort of lose the impact until you look at how they beautifully carved the head. What's so special about these ruins? It seems that these cattle kraal turned out to be very clever cattle kraal, obviously intended for very clever cattle. Because we start finding that many of them, and this is again the work of the brilliant Johann Heine, who discovered Adam's calendar and who didn't give up photographing these, who carried on trying for 20 years to bring this to the attention of the authorities, and they're still ignoring him, and now they're ignoring not only him but me as well. And it was Johann Heine that really started studying these from the aerial photographs and working out the geometries of these, and realized that these are really advanced structures with some advanced knowledge of geometry that are imprinted into these. You know, you guys got crop circles, we got stone circles that are 200,000 years old. It's just, you know, it's just spectacular. So whoever was building these is maybe sending us messages now to try and link the present to the past. That's what I'm beginning to think. And you start seeing that these ancient sacred geometry numbers of the divine and this knowledge of structure and the harmonic frequencies and that keep the universe together are well imprinted into many of these structures. And it's always aligned with the solstices and the equinoxes, and that's the surface stuff, really, you know, just show you where the sun comes up. You know, anybody can do that. You don't need to build a complex structure to point out where the sun comes up. The complexity of the structure is for far more important purposes and uses, which I believe have everything to do with harmonic resonant frequency and sound. And you see that. This one is just absolutely spectacular, because first you see the concentric circles, see that little flattened area in the top right-hand corner? That's very important. And then even an inside circle has a flattened area around it. And you start seeing what the brilliant physicist Nassim Haramein calls infinity within a finite space, or it's commonly known as that. And you start seeing this very distinct knowledge of, you know, quantum physics and advanced geometry and the obvious alignments. And then it gets even more mysterious, because you start realizing that when you extend that little flattened area at the top into the circle, you get a perfect hexagon. And from the studies that I've been doing, hexagon has everything to do with the material world, the representation of matter and the universe that we live in, while the pentagon has got everything to do with the divine, and the two are always connected, always linked. I'll go into a lot more detail about that in the workshops when we got more time. And you see the the tetrahedron beautifully, you know, from the corners of the hexagon touching the inner circle. These are not accidental geometric structures. This took a lot of planning and a lot of knowledge, and we realize that we're dealing with the knowledge of sacred geometry. You will know the fruit of life on the right-hand side, and the star tetrahedron shapes, the infinity within a finite space, the fractal structures that make up all the stuff that physics deals with today. All of this is encoded in these ancient structures. And we also know, I love this, because you suddenly realize that, you know, the Da Vinci Code and so forth, you know, Leonardo da Vinci clearly knew what he was doing when he drew the Vitruvian Man, because you can study this for probably the rest of your life. It's so encoded with incredible knowledge and information. And guess what? The guys that built the stone circles at Waterval-Boven in my little town knew all this 200,000 years ago. I find that quite amusing. And then the important thing, the stones ring like bells. Each one of these stones, when you lift it up and you hit it, rings like a bell. And then suddenly you realize, hold on, we're dealing with something here that has direct links to frequency, music, the generation of sound, these 6 primordial frequencies, the generation of matter and all this stuff, and energy. Where is the flagship among all these ruins? Clearly, it is Adam's calendar. And this is really such a spectacular sight. Credo Mutwa once again calls Adam's calendar with the Tsodilo caves, that serpent worship site I showed you. So that serpent worship site in northern Botswana. Adam's calendar is on the edge of the Barberton crater in Mpumalanga, not far from the town of Nelspruit. It's at a place called Kaapse Hoop in South Africa. right on the edge of the cliff, overlooking this incredible impact crater that's about 3 billion years old, called the Barberton Impact Crater. And it was discovered in 2003 by this guy here, Johann Heine, by accident. And Johann went out and he measured it, and he figured out that this was his calendar. This thing is absolutely, and still accurate today. Just another angle. See how that one edge was carved? This is very hard dolerite. Incidentally, these rocks also ring like bells. Okay, and they do not come from that area. They were brought from somewhere else. That to carve that stone like that, you can't do that with stone tools. It's just not possible. That's an aerial view from the helicopter. The tree on the right is the northern marker stone. There's a stone underneath the tree. I'm not saying that the tree is 200,000 years old. And the tree on the left is a southern marker, and then you got the two main calendar stones in the middle, and you'll see just now how the north-south dissects the two main calendar stones in the middle perfectly.
15 minutes. 15.
Then you got this north-south line. This is the north-south line in the opposite direction. And then we get the stone man. In 1994, they took out the stone man that looked at the rising of the spring equinox a long, long time ago. This is what he would have seen. They took him out for some stupid reason and removed him. Why is it a calendar? It's because it allows you to tell the movement of the sun, and the movement of the sun allows you to tell the exact day of the year. It starts on the right-hand side with a winter solstice, and as the sun sets, it tells you exactly what day of the year it is until the shadow hits the left-hand side, and that's the summer solstice. And then it stops and starts to move back. So it's still accurate today. There's a 3D representation. There you can see the stone man. We put stone man back in its place over here. That's where he stood, looking out over the two calendar stones. And what do you find on the eastern side? What have we found so far? We found an ancient workshop, the oldest carved sphinx, the first Horus, an ancient grave linking us to the Anunnaki, the first pyramids ever built, linked to Orion's belt, and the original Egyptian Ankh. It's not an Egyptian Ankh, it's a South African Ankh. We must just remember that Egypt is also in Africa. Sometimes we forget that. We see Egypt as this weird place somewhere else. No, it's in Africa. Except we've taken it from the north to the south. And it follows a thing about, going north. Everything came from the south. This is just indication of this ancient giant workshop. There's another stone man lying on his side. There's 3 stone men that we discovered. He's guarding the ritual path that Creator Mutwa talks about. He was initiated at the site in 1937. It's a well-known sacred site among South African shamans and sangomas. And then we found this tree on the horizon, and lo and behold, growing out of an ancient stone altar. We now believe this is a very important ancient grave linking us to the Sumerian Anunnaki deities. This is a beautiful carving of a sphinx, not far from Adam's calendar, about 300 meters away. It took us 7 years to find this. I walked this up and down hundreds of times. You don't see this. It's amazing how your eyes open as you start looking. We also believe that they may have had facial features, but they peel, and they're so old that they probably lost their facial features. This rock peels off. And then obviously the Egyptian Ankh. And what is an Egyptian Ankh? It's a frequency vibrational tool. It's a tuning fork with a healing device and all kinds of other things. And there's a beautiful Ankh carved again in that very hard diorite in a radiating circle, which tells us a lot more than just a picture of an Ankh. It tells us that the Ankh is a vibrational frequency device that was used for all things and everything to do, just like Royal Raymond Rife cured all disease in 1931 with vibrational frequencies of sound. The Ankh was used by the ancient civilizations to do similar kind of things. And there you can see even in Egypt they show you how they used the Ankh for healing. Dating the stones is very interesting. We use every possible scientific principle we can. This is not an easy job, people. You can't just walk there and say, all right, let's date the stuff. You stand over there. You know, it doesn't work like that. It's just like you got to just take this slowly and just absorb the stuff, let it wash over you and think about it and apply scientific principles as far as you can. And it's not always easy. And people are very quick and very easy to criticize you on this and that. Well, did you carbon date this? Did you do that? Did you do that? It doesn't work like that. You got to go back over and over and over again and let this thing unfold itself in front of you and become clear. And use your psychic ability and use channeling and use download, you know, stuff from advanced beings and whatever. We've got to understand that psychic ability is not something that is this mumbo-jumbo stuff, but it's a well-accepted science. It's an ability that's been tested and proven with many scientific experiments. The geology tells us that the rock is not from there. You can see some of the monoliths fall over. Black Reef Quartzite versus Dolerite. The bedrock is known as Black Reef Quartzite. Every stone of Adam's calendar is known as Dolerite. It's a very, very hard rock. It does not come from there. It comes from at least 1 kilometer away, but we haven't yet established whether that is the Dolerite that they used. The lichen growth is very interesting. This lichen grows at 1 millimeter per annum. Just by measuring this, it'll tell us just for the first layer to cover the stone will take 2,000 years, and we get multiple layers. And then you'll notice archaeoastronomy. The aerial shot clearly shows you that this was a circle. Originally it was a stone circle. Adam's calendar, you can see it, but north-south lies off 12 degrees. When we measured it, we got a 3 degree, 17 minute and 42 second deviation from current north-south. That tells us so much. I'm going to go into great detail, more detail about that, but we think we may have actually discovered a very important bit of information about the angle of planet Earth and what has happened to the current angle of planet Earth, 23.5 degrees in the past few thousand years. Probably with the same events that caused the flood, caused this movement from where it was to where it is today. That is why this calendar is out of line. These guys did not make mistakes. Erosion, if you look at this particular rock, the top piece broke off. You look at the erosion, the stone is lying, piece that broke off is lying right below it. There's at least a centimeter of erosion. Once again, put the geologists on the spot, say, how long will it take for this to erode? And I say, well, that's a long time. So how long? Okay, that's hundreds of thousands of years. Thank you. And then this rock caused lots of concern for me because it eroded a lot more. And then Credo Mutwa came to the rescue and said, well, they had to urinate on this rock while they were on their initiation process. And that's why it eroded a lot quicker than all the other monoliths. Otherwise, I would have been in trouble with my theories. The patina growth is probably our best argument scientifically. You can see the fresh breaks, those black rock. This is all a very specific rock called hornfels, silica dioxide, aluminium, and iron. When it breaks, these are fresh breaks, probably not that fresh anymore, very dark. And then when it breaks, you can start seeing that reddish skin of the rock starts to grow back. It's known as the patina. Now this one broke off at some stage in time, flat. The whole tip of this monolith broke off. And then this patina grew back. We've got about 2 millimeters of growth there. At this stage, scientific evidence tells us that this particular patina grows at about 5,000 years per microscopic layer. So to have 2 millimeters of growth, we know we're dealing with something really, really old. Not just something that's 200 or 2,000 or even 10,000 years old, but a lot older. Sterile alignment. We know that the ancients were obsessed with Orion's belt. You all know this, all Orion's belt alignments. Even Great Zimbabwe, incidentally, Richard Wade from University of Pretoria found out that Zimbabwe is aligned to Orion as well. And the Chinese pyramids also aligned with Orion. It's a view from the air, from the top, similar to Egypt, isn't it? And we thought, well, ours is more special, ours is better, ours is older, it should also be aligned to Orion. And we lifted up those obvious rocks lying at the bottom that were on the original circle. And guess what we found? Yeah, of course it's aligned to Orion, but you've got to go back at least 160,000 years and probably a lot older, because we got to take into consideration that 3 degree variation. And it gets really interesting. So there's a lot more work to be done there, but there's clearly an alignment with Orion. Could there be a guardian bird? Of course there's a guardian bird. The most important rock we missed was the one that guards the eastern sunrise, the spring equinox. When you go and lift it up, That's what you find. A beautiful carved Horus head. And what does Horus represent in Egypt? The rising of the sun. And guess what this Horus head does? It marks the rising of the sun. A long, long time ago. At this stage, we pin it at about 280,000 years. There you got your 3 Orion's belt stones. And incidentally, there's now a very strong link between Horus and Orion that many people are making. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see 2 little bubbles sticking up there. It took us 7 years to look at those. Sometimes you stare at the trees so hard that you can't see the wood for the trees. And then you see the beautiful pyramids in the valley. To figure out whether they were real pyramids, and I'm going to end this here, because we're going to take some questions. You want me to end, or? Okay. To figure out whether these were really pyramids, we had to go and test this, because we now know that these guys knew about energy, flow of energy, 5-factor, golden mean ratios, all these. So we went to Adam's calendar, to the stone altar, which we now believe belongs to the Sumerian Dumuzi. I'll go into much more detail about that in the workshop tomorrow. And because Dumuzi was Enki's youngest son, and I can tell you right now, we don't no longer call it Adam's calendar, we actually call it Enki's calendar. And we drew a golden mean spiral between the two, and that's what we find. It ends right between the pyramids. This, once again, what is the statistical probability that this can happen? Well, it's probably several billion to 1. Every dot on that picture is a statistical probability on its own. This is just to show you the pyramid. And just to show you what some of the stone circles look like, here I am showing my friend Brian, who runs a flying school called the Pyramid Flying School. He had no idea that there were pyramids right next to his farm in the Mpumalanga and in the Barberton crater. We went to look at that gold mine that I was sitting next to. Well, these circles are right next to that mine that I was sitting next to. And he took this picture of me. I was showing him where the wall of this ruined circle is. And there's a pyramid right behind me. It's covered by soil. Okay, I must tell you that my theory is that 13,000 years ago, when this event, the flood and all this catastrophe happened and wiped out the civilization, big walls of water came over planet Earth. It covered everything with soil. That's why most of the ruins we see, you cannot see from the air. You cannot see when you walk there. You can see them from the air, but you can't see them from the ground because they're covered by meters of soil, and so are the pyramids. The pyramids are covered by probably 30 or 40 meters of soil, trees growing on them, rock full of rocks. So they don't really look like pyramids until you start looking at them carefully. And when you draw a line between the Great Pyramids, Great Zimbabwe, it goes right through the pyramids of Adam's calendar. And they're all on the 31-degree east longitudinal line. And incidentally, remember that ancient languages were not about just language or slang. They had meaning. Each letter had a numeric value, and they structured words based on the power of the language. Well, do you know what the numeric value for El or Elohim is? 31. Do you think they were trying to tell us something? I'm going to skip through this. First architects, they not only built these structures, but they carved them into rock. This crack through this particular one tells us it's very, very old, the erosion on the crack. And then the archaeologists come and they do us a great big favor when they draw them. And they show us that they have no entrances. Some of them have amplification chambers, built in concentric circles. And each one is linked by this wire, by this channel. Everything is linked together. So what were all these stone circles used for? Just to remind you what they look like. Remember Nikola Tesla said that the earth rings like a bell. The sound frequency comes out of the earth everywhere. The Buddhists knew this. They drew their logo. They created their logo out of the sound coming out of the earth. This is the sound that the shape that the sound R makes when you put it through sand. This is R. Does it resemble a stone circle? Of course it does. And they're just to remind you how sound can represent or mimic these stone circles. Imagine if these stones were actually granules of sand. What you're looking at is the representation of the frequency of the sound of the planet of Mother Earth wherever that stone circle is. It's really the representation and fingerprint of the energy where that stone circle is. That's why each and every one is completely unique. And they're all linked by these roads because they were really energy devices. The Japanese tried to devise this death ray in 1944 to smite the Allied army with. And this is what they used. in the death ray, which they stole from Nikola Tesla. It's called a magnetron. It's a high-frequency, high-energy generator. It just wipes out thousands and thousands of people just by simply aiming it at them. And imagine how powerful a 22-meter diameter magnetron can be, and how much energy that will generate. And now you have a much clearer idea as to what these guys were doing in southern Africa. You're dealing with one giant energy generating grid, and it was generating energy to mine the gold, to prepare the gold, to do whatever they were doing with it. We'll go into that tomorrow in much greater detail and have time to discuss it. But we're dealing with a civilization that vanished probably about 13,000 years ago with the flood, completely vanished off the face of the earth, millions and millions of circular structures, and a giant civilization of millions of people that just disappeared off the face of the earth. That gave all the so-called great civilizations of the north a kickstart, and everything they used many thousands of years later originated down here in southern Africa. So we're going to stop here, and I think we're going to take some questions.